Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ranch Management Forum 2023. A link to the recorded webinar will be sent out to registered participants and posted to our website within about 24 hours following the presentation. At the end of the presentations, you are going to be prompted to take part in a short survey. Your feedback is important to us for planning future events, so we would ask that you fill that out if possible. And I'm now going to turn the webinar over to your facilitator for this session.
Hello everyone, and welcome to session 1 of Ranch Management Forum 2023, Keeping Forages Fertile. My name is Alexis DeCorby, and I am a livestock and feed extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture based out of Yorkton. I will be facilitating your webinar today. Today's webinar focuses on forage fertility, and there are 1.5 CEU credits available in nutrient management for this session. Our first presenter today is Dr. Jeff Schoenau. Dr. Schoenau is a professor of soil fertility and a professional agrologist who works at the Department of Soil Science at the University of Saskatchewan. He holds the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture's Soil and Nutrient Management Chair in the College of Agriculture and Bioresources and is a fellow of the Agricultural Institute of Canada. He was born in Saskatchewan, completed his undergraduate and graduate degrees in the 1980s in the College of Agriculture at the University of Saskatchewan and has worked there since. He also farms with his spouse, Lynn, near Central Butte, Saskatchewan. His research, teaching, and extension activities deal with soil fertility and fertilizers, nutrient cycling, and soil management practices in the prairie cropping systems. At this time, I would like to turn the webinar over to our presenter. Go ahead, Dr. Schoenau.
Great. Thanks a lot, Alexis. It's great to be with everybody this afternoon to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about forages in rotation and forage fertility management here as the first presenter in the Ranch Management Forum series. So thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. Please change. I guess when we think about forages, we maybe go right back to the beginning and perhaps ask ourselves the question, what happens when you convert marginal annually cropped land to long-term forage cover? And I think very much so the answer to that is that we really improve the quality and the health of that soil, and can also contribute to a buildup of fertility of that soil as well. Please advance. So improving soil health and fertility is really a very important aspect of having a forage crop growing on that land. And when we come back to soil health, I think the overall soil health and productivity of our prairie soils is very much related to organic matter. And soil organic matter, and sometimes we refer to that as humus, it's made of a number of elements. Much of it is made of carbon. About 50% of the organic matter is made of carbon by weight, and also other elements in there like hydrogen and oxygen, and also important nutrients like nitrogen, as well as sulfur and phosphorus. So folks, all of those really contribute to soil fertility and health. Next. And when we think about increasing the soil organic matter by growing forages, then, of course, what that means is actually more carbon is in the soil then, and therefore less carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas in the air. So really, when we think about a land conversion to forages, we recognize that what that creates really is a carbon sink. As we increase the organic matter, we increase the health, we increase the quality of that soil, the fertility, we also increase the amount of carbon that's stored in the soil. Next, please. And the other important role that organic matter does in the soil is that it really acts as the food for the microorganisms. It's a source of carbon for those microorganisms to respire and generate energy, as well as build microbial biomass. And when that organic matter is used as food and decomposed by soil organisms, nutrients are released into available forms like nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and recycled. So it's a very important part of the whole cycling system in the soil. Next, please. I want to talk a little bit about a study we conducted a few years ago to look at the impact of taking land and putting it into forages for a number of years. And this was work that was conducted in about 3 different locations in Saskatchewan. We did work in East Central Saskatchewan, in Northeastern Saskatchewan, and also in South Central Saskatchewan along the Missouri Coteau as well. And what we did is we looked at organic carbon and nutrient supply in side-by-side matches of annually cropped versus anywhere from 5 to 12 years of forage seed down. And we were able to do this because Ducks Unlimited had leases on some land on which they had upland a dense nesting cover that allowed for side-by-side comparisons similar to what we see here. Next slide, please. Where on one side of the fence we had a long-term forage seed down comparable to a cultivated annually cropped field on the other side of the fence. So we had a number of these that we could do comparisons. Next slide, please. Where we would take samples of soil out of the field, typically working with the surface horizon, the 0 to 15 centimeter or top 6 inches. And as you can see there in that photo, we take the soil samples using a fairly large PVC core so that we can measure the weight of the soil inside the core, which along with the concentration of carbon in the sample allows us to do comparisons of the mass of carbon in that depth among the different treatments that we're comparing. In this case, annually cultivated to a long-term forage seed down. Next slide, please. And also, when we take the soil out of there as an intact core, we are also able in that case to do some other measurements as shown here to measure the release rates of plant available nutrients using the PRS probes as shown there. Just wait till we get that back. Whoop. Yeah, oh, bouncing. Sorry, folks, I don't have, my computer's not letting me control the slides here, so the folks there are helping me out, and looks like we got her back though. Yeah, just about. Okay. Not sure why that's happening. Yeah, okay.
We'll just take a quick break here. Maybe now's a good time for some poll questions.
Sure.
Yeah, Alexis, I will, I'm just gonna make you not presenter, and then we'll switch it back and see if that fixes our glitch.
It was working for a while.
How are we doing now?
Seems like that's stable. That's great. So anyway, yeah, thank you. Thanks for bringing us back on board. Excellent. So what we did find is that, in fact, in those forage seed downs, there was appreciably higher amounts of carbon that were in that surface soil compared to our cultivated equivalent. It depended on the sites, but as you can see there, in some locations, it was substantially higher. So in terms of building organic matter in the soil over time and carbon storage rates, quite impressive in terms of what those forages can do. Next slide, please. The other thing that having those forages in the soil do, and we were able to document this in a very recent study that we completed here at the Livestock Forage Center of Excellence in Clavette with Dr. Bart Lardner and a research associate, Dr. Hangs, working with me, is the impact of having those forages on some other properties of the soil. And as shown here in this photo here, in this graph, showing that having different both annual forages like brassica and pea barley and fall rye clover, and also perennial forages, all were quite effective in lowering the density of that soil. And this is after only a 3-year period. Now, over 3 years, it's difficult to show measurable changes in organic carbon content, the total amount of organic carbon. Typically, it takes a few years, 5 years or more, to be able to start to see measurable changes in carbon. But we start to see differences in other properties of the soil, like the density, as shown here, that really reflect a greater root input, which decreases the density of that soil and allows for things like better entry of water infiltration into those forage soils. Next slide, please. So overall, in terms of fertility effects in these comparisons that we've done of long-term forages versus annually cultivated comparables, typically higher soil available nitrogen supply rates in those forage seed downs, particularly in the forage seed downs where we have a forage legume included as part of that forage mix, like alfalfa. And that really reflects the addition of organic nitrogen into those soils that comes from nitrogen fixation from the air, incorporation into that alfalfa, and those roots adding to that pool or reservoir of organic nitrogen in the soil. On the other hand, we did find in many of these forage fields low supplies of available phosphorus. And I think this probably reflects a continued removal of phosphorus in many instances by removal of hay, and that will deplete the soil fertility over the long term if it's not replaced through, for example, the addition of manure or addition of fertilizer. Next slide, please. So when it comes to forage crop nutrient removal, that's useful information to have if you're thinking about the need to replenish or replace those nutrients that are continually removed from the system if you're harvesting hay off of those fields. And as shown there for alfalfa, a pretty good yielding alfalfa crop there, 5 tons per acre, would have as much as 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the above ground material. Now, luckily, a vast majority of that nitrogen can come from fixation from the air through biological fixation by bacteria in the nodules of the roots of that legume. But the other nutrients shown there, like phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, there's a fair bit in that above ground material. And when we take it off the field as hay each year, over time, we will deplete the phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur fertility of the soil. And then we look below that, we see the grass, and we recognize that the grass, because it's not a legume, the nitrogen that's contained in that grass really all has to come from the soil if it's a straight grass stand. However, if we have a mix of alfalfa and grass together, we observe that some of the nitrogen in that grass, as it grows along with the alfalfa, some of the nitrogen in that grass is derived from fixation as a result of transfer of nitrogen from the alfalfa that carries out the fixation through the soil, gets released into available form that the grass can then take up. Next slide, please. So if we think about it, talking about converting annual cropland to forage, and we think a little bit about switching from forage into annual crop. Next, please. We recognize that when we're removing all of that above ground material with haying over time, it does remove a lot of nutrient. And to avoid deficiencies of nutrient in an annual crop that would follow that forage once it's terminated, we realize that we can run into some pretty low available nutrient status in a forage stand that's been terminated if we've been removing lots of nutrient out of that soil with haying over time. And without replenishment with fertilizer and manure, certainly that forage production can decline due to lack of fertility. And so we always need to be thinking about what we're doing in terms of both short-term and longer-term fertility considerations. Next, please. We may be thinking then about maybe having a forage legume in rotation just for a short period of time. And here what we're talking about is maybe a couple of years of having a forage legume like alfalfa or clover followed by an annual crop. And here we can see some real benefits. Even after only a couple of years of alfalfa or clover in there, those forage legumes like alfalfa or clover will fix not only the nitrogen for themselves to meet their requirements, but also leave some nitrogen behind that becomes available for the following crop. And so some research work that I've been involved in has shown a nitrogen fertilizer replacement value in the more moist regions of Saskatchewan, like the black and the gray soil climatic zones, a nitrogen fertilizer replacement value to a following crop of as much as 200 to 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre by having that legume in there as a preceding crop, that forage legume alfalfa for a couple of years. Next, please. So when we look at the amounts of nitrogen that are fixed in Western Canada by legumes, typically those forage legumes like the alfalfa and the clovers, those are the ones that come on top. But there are some other annual legume crops like faba beans and pea, for example, that also fix lots of nitrogen and are really good to include in an annual forage cropping type system or a cover cropping system as well. Next, please. And overall, I think one of the things that we've observed in our research work is that forage legumes are rather efficient nitrogen fixers. And this graph shows on the y-axis there the percent NDFA, and that refers to the percentage of nitrogen in that plant that is derived from the atmosphere through biological fixation by the bacterium in the roots of that, in the nodules on the roots of that legume. And folks, we can see here in this work that was done by Ghazala Isa, a PhD student who worked with myself and Diane Knight in his PhD program, documenting this percentage of nitrogen derived from fixation. In alfalfa, it was as high as 95%. A couple of other forage legumes there, milk vetch and sainfoin, not quite as good nitrogen fixers as the alfalfa, but still in all cases, above 80% of the nitrogen in the plant came from the air through biological fixation. And that's a very important contribution. Next, please. So we think about what the benefits are of having a forage legume in a rotation to a following crop. We recognize that there's these nitrogen benefits, direct nitrogen benefits, and also non-nitrogen benefits. And when we're talking about non-nitrogen benefits, that can be other nutrients. And perhaps a good example of that is phosphorus, where we have observed that by growing a deep-rooted legume crop like alfalfa or clover in a short-term rotation for a couple of years, the deep roots of that forage legume going down deep into the subsoil can solubilize some phosphorus at depth that a lot of other crops cannot access, and bring that up to the surface and help maintain the available phosphorus in that soil for a couple of years. So that can be a benefit as well as the improved tilth, also a break in pest cycle as well. Next, please. And we look at rooting systems. If we think about annual crops that we would grow like wheat, canola, and flax, different types of rooting systems, fibrous in the case of wheat. Canola has a kind of combination tap plus fibrous, and flax is a tap root, but really none of those roots really of those crops can extend quite as far as a forage legume like alfalfa that can extend way down into that subsoil and be able to access water and nutrients at depth and recycle and bring those nutrients up to the surface. And that's a benefit of having those types of crops, for example, those forages, even in a short-term rotation. Next, please. So I guess that kind of moves us on to talk a little bit about a rotation and some of the longer term aspects of related to having forages on your fields and moving from an annual crop to a forage and from a forage back to an annual crop. I want to talk a little bit now about just general forage fertilizer nutrient needs. And we certainly recognize that there's a lot of, I guess I would say, under fertilized forage fields out there that could really respond to added fertilizer. And I think a little bit of fertilizer can go a long way, folks, to bringing that stand back into life and really is part of an effective rejuvenation strategy. And what I've observed over the years is that some of these hayed grass stands like brome, wheatgrass, ryegrass, they're old. They've had a lot of nutrient hauled off of them over the years when they've been hayed, frequently nitrogen, phosphorus deficient, also sometimes potassium, sulfur, and even occasionally micronutrient deficient, especially if there's been high crop removal over the years. Next, please. And I guess some general rules of thumb I think are useful to keep in mind here. If you've got a stand in which the legume dominates, say more than 50% of that stand is comprised of a legume, you're probably not going to see big responses to added nitrogen. And the reason why is if the nitrogen isn't there, what the legume will do is it will fix the nitrogen through the biological fixation if it's not available in the soil. And when you add a lot of nitrogen fertilizer to a legume, what it will do is it'll just use the available nitrogen that you added as fertilizer instead of fixing it. So not a big benefit. Instead, what we observe, folks, is that those mixed stands and stands that are dominated by legumes often respond better to phosphorus and than nitrogen, and respond better to applied phosphorus than a pure grass stand alone. And I think this really reflects in part that those legumes have pretty high phosphorus requirements. They do a good job of solubilizing phosphorus out of the soil, but again, if you've had a legume in there for a number of years and you've pulled a lot of phosphorus out of that field through hay harvest, chances are you're looking at a pretty deficient situation. And I think when it comes to ensuring maximum stand longevity as far as phosphorus fertility is concerned, it's probably best to start out with good phosphorus fertility to begin with, meaning that you may go in and add some higher rates of phosphorus fertilizer that you may band into there at the beginning before you seed to provide lots of phosphorus there that's going to last the life of that stand. I think that's more efficient than trying to broadcast the phosphorus later on, because generally broadcasting of an immobile nutrient like phosphorus often doesn't work that well. It tends to get hung up and stay at the surface rather than getting down into the soil where the roots are. Next slide, please. For potassium, legumes also have high potassium requirements, and in areas of Saskatchewan where potassium deficiency may be of greater incidence, like sandy soils, especially sandy gray soils on the northern agricultural fringe, potassium fertilization shown to be beneficial not only in increasing yield, but also protein content and reducing the winter kill as well. And on those same kinds of soils where we may encounter sulfur deficiency, sandy texture, gray soils, soils formed under boreal forest that have inherently low sulfur fertility, sulfur may also be a limitation. And again, those forage legumes have high sulfur requirements, and responses may be observed to sulfur fertilization as well. And even in a few instances, folks, micronutrient deficiency could be a factor, like boron deficiency has sometimes shown up on alfalfa growing on very sandy, low organic matter, high pH soils, especially again in some of those gray soils on the northern agricultural fringe. So we need to be aware of all the nutrients and potential limitations that may exist. Your soil test is a good tool. Also, a tissue sample can be good as well in terms of diagnosing a potential deficiency out there. Next, please. When it comes to addressing a nitrogen deficiency, for example, by application of nitrogen fertilizer on a grass stand, we do need to be cognizant that we may see large losses of nitrogen through gassing off of ammonia if you're just surface broadcasting on their regular urea, 4600. It could be possible to lose as much as a quarter of the nitrogen that you apply through that volatilization if it just sits there on the surface, because as it sits there on the surface, what happens is an enzyme there in that surface thatch produces an enzyme is present that produces hydrolysis of the urea and production of ammonia gas. And if that ammonia gas is produced right on the surface, folks, it has nowhere to go but up. If you could, if it was available, but it's not available here, but as a granular source, ammonium nitrate is a good source, because the nitrogen in ammonium nitrate is not susceptible to volatilization like the nitrogen in urea is. Also, ammonium sulfate would be a better granular source for broadcasting. However, in the case of ammonium sulfate, you've got sulfur in there that you're paying for that really may not be a benefit to your stand. And so probably I think a good strategy when you're looking at applying a granular nitrogen source to a deficient grass stand and you're using urea would be to treat that urea with a urease inhibitor, NBPT, products like Agritane, Limus, and other ones. Those could help reduce that volatile ammonia loss. They typically inhibit that enzyme responsible for the volatilization for a period of time, couple of weeks, and that gives an opportunity to have some rain come along and move that urea into the soil. Once you get that hydrolysis taking place in the soil, the ammonia formed in the soil, it gets converted into ammonium and it's retained. Another possible option when it comes to nitrogen fertilization is using a polymer-coated urea. And that polymer coating on that urea can help reduce loss of nitrogen in a broadcast application as well. One strategy that we looked at in some research is with nitrogen solution. urea ammonium nitrate, UAN solution that contains a solution of urea, and also ammonium and nitrate. And the ammonium and the nitrate in there really not susceptible to volatilization losses like that urea component. And it can be effective, especially if a rain follows application, to get that dribble banded UAN into the soil. Next slide, please. So this actually shows a trial that we did a few years ago on a grass stand north of Saskatoon near Rosthern. On the left-hand side is our check without any nitrogen fertilizer added. And then you can see the strip there where we added 100 pounds of N per acre as a dribble banded urea, along with 25 pounds of phosphorus as a liquid ammonium polyphosphate. And you can see there particularly the response that we got, which was very significant in the end in terms of both increasing the yield and the protein content of that forage grass. Next slide, please. And the protein benefit certainly shows up here. We got our maximum yields in terms of the biomass, the forage yield, around about 50 to 70 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that also produced, as you can see there, a sizable increase in the protein content. Above that, 100 pounds actual N per acre and above, we really weren't getting any kind of a significant yield increase, but you can see the protein content was still going up. Now, you know, as we realize, of course, nitrogen fertilizer is pretty expensive, especially these days. So, you know, perhaps 200 pounds of nitrogen or even 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre is it would be a pretty expensive proposition. It does increase the protein content. We saw our maximum yield in this study around 50 pounds of N per acre, but that 200 pounds of N per acre, next slide, please, actually gave us a very significant yield response the second year after application. So nitrogen fertilizer that you add that's not used by that forage crop in the year of application, folks, is actually really very efficiently retained in that system and made available in following years. Next slide, please. So some of our observations, first point. Next. Good yield and protein response. Rain after application always helps, but it really didn't make much difference whether we dribble banded it on the surface or coultered it in. Even just dribble banding on the surface worked well, but we always had a rain after application. Next point. We didn't see a lot of response to added phosphorus unless we added a high rate of nitrogen, and that we attributed to that in these grass stands there was enough phosphorus that was being mineralized, released from the organic matter in the root zone of those grasses to supply sufficient phosphorus, except unless we added really high rates of nitrogen and we're going for the top end of the forage yield. Next, please. And so it didn't take a lot of nitrogen, you know, maybe 30 to 50 pounds in some instances was able to double the grass yield on those stands. And I think an economically effective strategy for rejuvenation. Next point. Yeah. And really, when we went up to higher rates, you know, greater than 100 pounds N per acre, we did see some significant carryover to the crop the following year. And those grasses were very effective in recovering that nitrogen in the year of application. Next slide, please. For phosphorus and potassium, as I said, for those nutrients, those are nutrients that we consider to be immobile. They don't move very easily in the soil. And so to get them close to where the roots are, in-soil placement, I think, is preferred for getting the best short-term response. Broadcast can work okay too. And over time, you're going to get it back. But in the year of application, generally not as efficient as an in-soil placement. And that concept of building up enough phosphorus and potassium fertility that in your soil at the start, when you establish that forage stand, enough to last the life of the stand, I think is a good strategy. And those soils under grasslands are often what we observe nutrient sponges. You get rapid nutrient uptake, and because they're really good in soaking up that applied nutrient, they do have a pretty wide application window for getting that nutrient onto the field. Next, please. So those are commercial fertilizers. I'd like to move on and really end off with a look at manures. And first with liquid manures and forages, liquid manures like liquid swine manure or liquid dairy manure. With those liquid manures, obviously we'd like to inject them into the soil, get them into the ground to not only reduce odor, but also reduce the nutrient loss and increase the recovery. And in our trials that we've conducted with liquid manures, mainly liquid swine manure that we've worked with over the years, and in forage stands, have seen very good recovery and very good response of forage stands to the injection of liquid manure, particularly those old nutrient deficient 10 or 20 or 30-year-old grass stands that have had a lot of nutrient taken out of them over the years through haying. Next slide, please. And there's some really good equipment out there that allows you to inject get that liquid manure into the ground where the roots are and maximize the recovery on a forage stand with very little or no injury or disturbance to that stand, as shown there in the slides. So if we can get that in, next slide, please. The responses can be substantial, and this was a site that we had a few years ago at the Prairie Agriculture Machinery Institute, east of I think it was around Engelfeld, Watson area, and this was an old crested wheat stand, hugely nutrient deficient, very nutrient deficient, and that was the response that we saw to 3,300 gallons per acre of injected liquid swine effluent, which was equivalent to about 100 pounds of N, available N, and about 20 pounds of phosphorus and some potassium and other nutrients in there. And you can see this huge greening up very early on in the following spring. Next slide, please. So in terms of the actual yield response that we saw to that, we had a check and we had 3,300 gallons per acre and we had 6,600 gallons per acre, and we were able to quadruple the biomass hay yield off of that old stand and produce also a 10-fold increase in the seed yield of that old crested wheat stand. And I always say in my career working with different sources of nutrients and fertilizer materials, some of the biggest responses that I've seen out there in terms of just increase in yield and productivity have been where manure, particularly liquid manure, has been applied to some of these really deficient old hay lands. Just huge responses. Next slide, please. Moving on to solid manures and forages. Solid manure is a little bit different than liquid manures. Solid manures, like your cattle penning manure, they are really quite slow release sources of nutrient. In fact, with cattle penning manure in the first couple of years of application, especially where you got a lot of straw mixed in with the manure, you get very little release of available nitrogen to the crop in that first couple of years. Over a number of years, as decomposition proceeds and the carbon gets blown off and the C/N ratios narrow, eventually you start to get that nitrogen tied up in that organic material being released to available form through mineralization. But it can be a slow process. And when we're talking about using solid cattle manure to fertilize forages, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to incorporate it. And so when it sits there on the surface, folks, that further slows that nutrient release and reduces that nutrient recovery. And so really what we observed in some research work that we did a number of years ago, Bart Lardner and myself and a couple of graduate students out at the Termunde farm at Lanigan, is that infield feeding we showed to be a more effective approach to nutrient cycling and forage response than feeding in the pen. And in particular, the nitrogen that's in the urine is much better conserved in an infield overwintering system compared to feeding in the yard in a pen. Next slide, please. And so from a nutrient cycling standpoint, if you think of those bales out there, you kind of sometimes got to think of them as fertilizer because they do contain nutrients. And in a 1,400-pound hay bale, there's maybe 30 pounds of nitrogen, 5 pounds of phosphorus, 25 pounds of potassium, and 3 pounds of sulfur. But it really doesn't do anything in terms of recycling until you have, I guess, what we call the four-legged fertilizer factories out there that consume those bales and the nutrients within, and actually the cows retain relatively little of the nitrogen and phosphorus in that feed in their bodies. Most of it goes out the other end, a lot of the phosphorus in the fecal material and a lot of the nitrogen in the urine. And folks, when that occurs out there in the field, that nitrogen and phosphorus is more effectively transported and available for utilization directly by that forage to use as a nutrient source to grow and again be harvested for bales again. Compared to in a pen in the yard where we can lose a lot of the nitrogen that's released in urine through volatilization losses to the air, where it's gone from the system. Next slide, please. So putting some numbers to this and some work that was done by a graduate student a few years back, Paul Yanish in his master's program, looked at this nutrient recycling. And the first shown here is the effect on forage, and this was Russian wild rye growth the first year of hauling that manure out and spreading that cattle manure on the surface of that Russian wild rye with a manure spreader. We got a little bit of yield response there, but not nearly as good a yield response as when the same amount of nutrient in feed was fed right out there in the field, as showing there was significantly higher yield in the bale grazing and bale processing in-field feeding overwintering system. Next slide, please. And those responses out there, certainly was a first year, but they can persist for a few years beyond that. And as shown there, you can see the circular areas in the field there with the greater forage growth that represents the effect of those residual nutrients from the urine, the dung, and the uneaten field, still contributing after a couple of years to increased grass growth out there in the field. Next slide, please. So putting some numbers to this, looking at nutrient recovery in the forage, and here some numbers on capture of nutrient that was added in the feed and the bedding infield and went through the animal and out the other end that was actually captured by the forage in that winter feeding system. We were getting anywhere from 30 to 45% of the added N in that feed and bedding, ultimately recovered in the forage, 21 to 32% of the added phosphorus. Compared to where we fed the cattle in a pen that feed, took the manure out, hauled it out, spread it in the pasture. What did we capture in the forage? Folks, a lot less of that nutrient was captured that was originally in that feed. Only 5 to 9% of the added nitrogen, 3 to 5% of the added phosphorus. Next point. So really what that shows and what we were able to demonstrate in this work, more efficient conservation and recycling of those nutrients with that in-field feeding system compared to the pen feeding system. Next, please. We do need to be cognizant, though, that when we are in-field overwintering, that there are nutrients in that manure pack that's left out in that field that can be transported with water when the snow melts. So we want to be choosing those in-field overwintering sites carefully to make sure that the runoff water from those fields is contained within the field rather than being allowed to run off of that field and down through channels and enter into some sensitive water body. Because in another study, we were able to document quite high levels of phosphate in that runoff water from those in-field feeding sites. Next slide. So to conclude, folks, I think really what we've observed, I think, is in a number of research studies is that forages are a really great way to improve the soil quality, increase the organic matter content, increase the nutrient supplying power. We need to be thinking about nutrient input versus nutrient removal, and especially capitalizing on that external input of nitrogen through biological nitrogen fixation by the legume in the partner. And so that transfer of nitrogen from the legume to the non-legume in a binary mixture of a legume grass mixture is an excellent way to make sure that nitrogen is supplied and cycled through this system. We do need to be cognizant that if we take a lot of nutrient off of that system over time in haying, especially the phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, other nutrients, we do need to be looking down the road at how we're going to put that back into the system. So really maximum benefit from those systems, I think, folks, obtained through good fertility management. I say they're perennial forage systems, but also annual forage systems as well. Next point, final point. So really in fertility management, getting that maximum benefit, I think, folks, really means thinking about it, considering both short-term fertility needs and also long-term fertility, nutrient balancing when you're planning your nutrient management strategy in your forage system. And next slide, please. To thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schoenau. We are now ready to take questions. So if you've not already done so, please type your questions in the question box in the bottom right-hand side of the control panel. If we don't get to all of our questions during this time, we will ask our presenter to answer them in the chat or follow up via email. So I can see there is one question here already. It was, how much phosphorus would you suggest at the time of seeding?
I think you kind of, if you think about it in terms of the amount of phosphorus that your stand is likely to take up and be in the material that's harvested over a number of years, that can be a very good guide. So if you have just like the table I showed you, nutrient removal in an alfalfa brome grass stand, annual removal at this much yield, and you anticipate that yield over 5 years, and that's how much is going to be used every year, removed in the hay harvest, you might aim for that as what you were going to band in as a phosphorus fertilizer at the start when you establish that stand. So, you know, I'm thinking of some trials that were done by Dr. Molly in Melfort area, and I think he was seeing that around anywhere from maybe 70 to 100 pounds of P2O5 per acre at the start really worked well in supplying phosphorus in a stand, you know, maybe with a life of 5 to 7 to 8 years was a pretty good strategy. So just as a ballpark, yeah. So it would be, and of course that amount of phosphorus is, you cannot safely place that with the seed of your forage. In fact, forages are really, both grasses and the forage legumes are sensitive to phosphorus placed in the seed row. So that you would want to be banding or broadcasting and incorporating prior to your seeding of your forage. You could also band it at the time of seeding as well if you've got the equipment to do it. That would, but make sure you're not trying to put really high rates of phosphorus in the seed row with that forage seed.
Thank you so much. Next question was, which is more productive, fertilizing in the spring or fall?
I think that you know, either one can be effective, and in many instances can be similar in their effectiveness. And the reason why is that those forage stands will suck up a lot of that nutrient when it's applied. The biomass in there, the root, if a fall application, they'll take it up. And similarly, a spring application, of course, is effective as well. Generally, we always say, you know, the closer to the time of plant demand, the more efficiently that fertilizer nutrient will be used. But because those forages are real nutrient sponges, those stands, you know, we've got a pretty wide window of application when it comes to timing of application.
Perfect. There's another question here. So what would be your advice in talking with farmers about the trade-off of not adding an adequate amount of phosphorus when establishing their perennial forage crop? This year, with the high MAP prices, farmers are concerned if they're establishing a new stand.
So I guess, yeah. So I guess the thing, it certainly is a challenge when you're thinking about, you know, applying enough phosphorus to last the life of a stand, and you're looking at some really high fertilizer prices now that maybe down the road might go down. You know, so I still think, you know, you'd want to, you'd be maybe looking at, you know, 20 to 30 pounds of P2O5 at the start, just to make sure you got enough for a couple of years. You can go in, you know, in subsequent years and broadcast. It's not real efficient, but with alfalfa, it's got some surface feeder roots. I've seen some research data that shows that it's not too bad. You also have the opportunity of a liquid phosphorus fertilizer source that you could come in with later on as well. So yeah, you may be little bit reluctant, I can understand, in putting a lot of money up front for high-priced phosphorus fertilizer, putting it all on at the start to carry through. But I think some at the start is worthwhile to give that initial supply, and then maybe come in afterwards and put your phosphorus on later. I think again, those deep-rooted grasses and forage legumes can get down, and they do a pretty good job, especially the forage legumes, of accessing some phosphorus at depth in the subsoil. Some of that more recalcitrant or less soluble calcium phosphate forms that we find in the subsoil. So they're actually a good way to actually recycle and bring up some of that less available phosphorus that some other crops aren't able to access.
Okay, this one is slightly switching gears, but do you know of any livestock disease risks with applying manure as fertilizer?
Not sure about that, and I don't know whether I could. I'm probably not, I've never ever seen it come up as a big issue, but I probably would defer that to somebody who is more in the veterinary epidemiology area rather than a soil fertility person.
Fair enough. So what soil tests do you recommend to evaluate the forage stands?
Well, I guess I think that I think it's useful to know what your organic matter content is. And in terms of available nutrients in there, you can measure the concentrations or the supply rates, release rates, depending on the soil test that you're employing. I think in those forage stands, often you don't see a lot of available nutrient, a lot of nutrient hanging around in the soil in the available form at any one time. They're pretty rapidly recycled, and so some type of an assessment of nutrient supply can be useful. The organic matter content can be used as a proxy for assessing, estimating the mineralization. So I think in general, I would say that any of the tests out there are a valuable tool. The surface is where a lot of the action happens, no doubt, in terms of recycling of nutrients, release through decomposition. But yeah, I think that the soil tests out there are a very useful tool, any of them, in interpreting what's available, what's potentially available in that soil, what the organic matter content is, and also other important attributes as well, like the salinity, for example. And oftentimes forages are seeded on marginal land, soil that may be a little bit salty, and you may be interested in just what's happening to the salinity levels in your soil, how that forage may be growing, and how it may be growing in relation to the salinity levels in your soil. And the soil test can give you some indication of that by measuring what's called the electrical conductivity. So yeah, good. And now with GPS, you can go out, you can establish a benchmark, and you can make those measurements over time, over a number of years, and see what that forage is really doing in terms of your soil properties and improving the health of your soil.
Okay, so the next question was, did you find using the coulter to add fertilizer to the alfalfa stand was hard on the alfalfa?
No, we did the work that we did with the coultering. That was all dominantly grass stand, so there was really not any injury issues. But I do recall some work that we did with PAMI a number of years ago in the Valparaiso area in northeastern Saskatchewan, where we were looking at injecting liquid swine manure with a coulter system, and that was quite a bit heavier system and did a lot more disturbance. There may have been a little bit of injury there, but I don't recall it being a huge factor. So it seemed like even on those established stands, and even with a broadleaf, that yeah, there may be some injury, but at least in our case, it didn't seem to be a major issue. Certainly not in the grass stands that we worked with in coultering in.
Okay, so our next question is, in your experience, what is the success rate of seeding legumes into an existing grass stand?
Okay, that's it. Yep. So we've done a little bit of work with stands that have been sod seeded, and I think that's what the question refers to, is introducing legumes like alfalfa or maybe sandfoin or milk veg or some other legume into a grass stand through sod seeding. It can be a little bit challenging. I think it works best if you have an opener system like a disc that creates relatively little disturbance and that doesn't dry that seed bed out and still allows some good seed soil contact. I understand as well that sod seeding tends to work better in the more moist areas. And some people have even had some success with broadcasting legume seed out in the field and then allowing the cattle out there in the field to kind of seed it, but incorporate it in and get establishment that way. Certainly, it does pose some challenges, but and we're going to be doing some more work on this. Dr. Bill Belletgu and myself and Bart Lardner in some trials that we're going to have underway here of sod seeding both alfalfa and some other legumes as well. And again, I think yeah, the establishment is something that good equipment helps, I think. And moisture, good moisture, I think is the key to getting that seed established and getting a decent germination and emergence of the seed. Yeah. You don't want to rip it up too much, I think and so I think a low disturbance opener, I think, is my impression, tends to work better than something that creates a lot of disturbance like a wide hoe or a sweep.
Okay, a few more questions here. So what's the best mixed forage crop to plant for new ranchers that would like to grow a small bison herd? On a quarter section, their soil is very rocky and gravelly.
Yeah, and so this kind of gets more into the forage mix rather than the sort of a bit beyond my expertise, I guess, in terms of soils and soil fertility. But thinking about those kinds of soils like that are kind of rocky, sandy, kind of difficult soils, probably generally of low fertility because of the sandy texture. Maybe there's been some erosion in the past, so not of low fertility, sandy texture. I think they're probably a grass legume mixture like a brome grass alfalfa would be, I think, a very good mix. And there you've got that legume with its ability to bring a lot of nitrogen externally from the air into the system through fixation, provide it to the grass. You know, the phosphorus and the potassium may be a limitation depending on where you are. So that's maybe where you'd want to look at putting some P and K on at the time of establishment on there. Enough that's going to carry it through for a little while, 2 or 3 years, looking at it. But that mixed stand is really going to help in the nitrogen fertility. The deep-rooted nature is also going to help that stand against moisture stress, which you're liable to encounter in that sandy soil as well. I've heard a number of folks say that they were really wished if they had a second chance they wouldn't go with a straight grass stand. That now in retrospect they would look at a mixture of both a legume and a grass for the benefits that it can provide. And I think that's especially true on those kinds of sandy, rocky soils.
Awesome. So this one's a little bit of a hypothetical question. So looking down the road, if you're going to bale graze on stands, what is the future concern or problem that we might see in a couple of decades, if any? Or what are we going to be talking about in a couple of years when we do that?
Well, I think, I mean, the infield feeding, the bale grazing, I think is a very effective way to move nutrients around on the farm and really to get them where they're needed. And so I guess when we think about grazing there and infield feeding, there's also some constraints. And ideally, maybe an eroded knoll in a field, the top of a hill, would be the most beneficial place to get the nutrients and the organic matter that come with that infield feeding. But unfortunately, up at the top of the hill, that's a pretty cold place to be. for the cattle in the winter. Not a lot of shelter there, but you can move shelter. There are portable shelters. Of course, you could use that approach to move it out there. I guess the other consideration might be in terms of how much nutrient might move off of that area in the runoff water and be lost. So there's a tendency maybe to want to infield feed in those lower lying areas, maybe next to a shelter belt of trees, and I think that's fine. But I think also that you want to be looking at how you can rotate those areas around your farm and in different fields in order to get that nutrient distributed. And I think when the intensity is a little bit too high in terms of a very confined area, there can also be some issues there associated with having too much material left behind, uneaten hay and bedding material that's left behind, that makes it really difficult if it's an annually crop field to actually seed in there the following year. So I think really, the long-term longevity of that practice, I think really involves kind of rotating and moving those areas around and thinking about what parts of the farm are going to benefit most from the nutrients and the organic matter that you're adding, but within the practical constraints of where that area might be in relation to other considerations like protection from the elements and proximity to a waterway, for example.
Okay, this question is more of a commentary to that kind of point. The comment was, it appears spreading pen manure is a slow release, so there are longer term benefits to spreading versus in-field feeding, correct?
Yeah, I guess once the spreading on the surface, yeah, it's going to be released more slowly, actually really quite slowly. And there's also a greater potential for the loss when it sits there, on the surface out there for a period of time in runoff. If it's a manure that contains a lot of urine and fecal material, not much straw, if you're spreading it on the surface, you also can lose nitrogen there through ammonia gassing off from the nitrogen in that manure as well. So with manure, we always kind of use the sort of the adage, get it in the ground if you can. Yeah, it's going to release slower out there. I guess where the problem comes in a pen and hauling it out into the field is a lot of that nutrient, especially the nitrogen, gets lost in that pen before it actually gets into the manure and gets hauled out into the field. So from an overall efficiency standpoint, from beginning to end, feed that's going in and recycling out ultimately back into that field and into the hay again, we do find that infield system to be more efficient in the long run.
Okay, so a couple more questions. What do you think about shallow disking old root-bound forage stands to rejuvenate them and thin out the stand or possibly level them?
And I don't think I can answer that question because I've never really worked with just a scenario where the land was just disked without having any type of amendment made to it, like a fertilizer or a manure. But I'm thinking back to trials that we ran where we had a disturbed and an undisturbed control, along with the disturbance and the disturbance associated with adding the nutrient, whether it was manure or fertilizer along with it. And I seem to remember that there wasn't a lot of difference in the yield between the disturbed and the undisturbed. So I guess from that, I would say, I wouldn't expect a huge response from that disking or tillage or disturbance alone. I think probably the biggest response is going to be coming from if you're getting some nutrients in there into that really deficient soil and providing that nutrients that forage needs for it to grow.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we're going to cut it off there for questions in the interest of time, and we'll follow up with any other questions going forward. So thanks so much for your presentation again, Dr. Schoenau, and we'll get right into our second presentation here, which will be Jordan Johnson.
Great, thank you very much.
So Jordan is our livestock and feed extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture based at the Swift Current. Jordan has her Bachelor of Science in Animal Bioscience and a Master of Science in Animal Science from the University of Saskatchewan. Prior to joining the ministry, she spent several years working in research and extension, focusing primarily on ruminant nutrition and physiology. In addition to her interest in all aspects of livestock nutrition, Jordan also enjoys helping producers implement environmentally sustainable practices on their operations and collaborating on research projects of importance to livestock producers in Saskatchewan. At this time, I'll go ahead and turn the webinar over to our presenter. Go ahead, Jordan.
Thank you, Alexis. Everything is showing up good there on your end?
Looks perfect.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you very much, for the opportunity to present here today. I'm pretty excited to follow Jeff's presentation there because I think this project does a really nice job of putting a lot of those principles that Jeff just shared into practice and kind of showing producers what those results might look like on farm if they fertilize their forage stands. So this is an adopt project that I was involved with this past summer that evaluated the use of nitrogen use or fertilizer application in mixed forage stands. So kind of briefly, I'll go over the overview here that we're going to touch on today. So I'll give a bit of background on, why we fertilize forage stands and what responsible nutrient stewardship looks like when you're fertilizing those forage stands. I'll go over some project history, the objectives of the project, as well as the design before getting to the results there that we saw this past summer, and then leave you all with some conclusions and considerations going forward for managing your forage stands. So first and foremost, it's probably prudent of me to go through what an ADOPT project is. So for those of you that aren't familiar, ADOPT stands for Ag Demonstrations of Practices and Technologies. So what this does is it's a funding stream provided by the Ministry of Agriculture in partnership with some industry groups that provide funding for producer groups, or in my case, ministry specialists, to demonstrate and evaluate new agricultural practices and technologies at a local level so that the results of those trials can be shared with producers like I am today, or agronomists. I know there's probably a number of agronomists in the crowd as well. So that those results can basically be used to inform the decision-making process behind implementing these technologies on farm. So full disclosure, I'm not an agronomist. As you heard from Alexis, my background is very strong on the livestock side of things. So my approach to this project is largely focusing on the forage benefits or the yield benefits for livestock producers that you'll have from implementing fertility plans for forage stands. So first off, I guess this is just a little bit of a recap of what Jeff shared here earlier, but the importance of fertilizing forage stands, I think, is stronger now than ever when we're looking at maintaining the productivity of those existing forage stands. Increasing cost of land and feed prices has made it quite a challenge to remain profitable for a lot of livestock producers. And, I think it's easy for us to forget about forage stands when we're looking at managing our feed sources here. So like any crop, Jeff showed there that forages require fertilizer and replacement of those nutrients to improve productivity or to maintain the longevity of that stand. And not only is cost of land increasing, but availability is even becoming a challenge. I know many producers just don't have access to land nearby to obtain, to put on their forage production. So that's a bit of a challenge as well. And I think considering the proximity to your operation is one component of that as well. Transport costs are really high right now. So if you can find land close to your operation, that's more beneficial than those that are far away. And I like to say that, in some ways, forage stands at least are kind of the forgotten child of the fertilizer industry. So Jeff showed a similar table here earlier showing that, grass hay or alfalfa hays. I have 1 ton here of either forage here, kind of showing the amount of nutrients that are removed with 1 ton of hay. So for nitrogen, you're looking anywhere from 34 to 58 pounds per ton of hay, phosphorus 10 to 14 pounds, potassium 43 to 60 pounds per ton of hay produced, and sulfur anywhere from 4 to 6 pounds. So over years and years, that adds up to quite a large amount of nutrients being removed from these forage stands if we're not ever really putting nutrients back in. So why fertilize forage stands? So I already mentioned that cost of feed is increasing. Thankfully, I have an intern who scours the internet day and night and kind of keeps track of online hay and forage sale ads. And, he noted prices anywhere from 5 cents a pound to 13 cents a pound from September to January of the past year. At a number of events throughout the past couple months here, I've had producers say they're paying at least 10 cents a pound before that hay is even shipped right now. So those are considerable costs, and when we haven't even gotten to the transportation cost there, which increases that further. So I think that if you can maintain the productivity or improve yields of your forage stand by fertilizing, that offers a really good risk management opportunity for producers as well, and an opportunity to reduce those transportation costs if you can produce hay more locally to your operation instead of bringing it in from further away. When we look at responsible nutrient stewardship, the fertilizer industry has done a really good job promoting sustainability and stewardship through awareness and adoption of those 4R principles, which are the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place when it comes to fertilizer application. And so this project that I'm sharing with you today really evaluated the right source aspect of those 4R principles and applying that to forage stands. So broadcast application is the most common method of application of nitrogen onto existing forage stands, but as Jeff mentioned earlier, and as we know, without incorporation, that risk for nitrogen loss is increased when you use that approach and when these reactions occur on the soil surface. So I think that's one aspect we wanted to evaluate here with this project. And then a second component to that is that, as many of you are likely aware, there are increasing concerns around the emissions of fertilizer and reducing those to meet the Fertilizer Canada goals of reducing emissions by 30%, I believe, by 2030. So that's another component that I think this project ties into really well right now. When we look at how nitrogen is lost, there's two primary routes there. The first is volatilization. This occurs when an enzyme called urease converts urea into ammonium, which occurs rapidly with very little moisture required for this to happen on the soil surface. So during this conversion process, the ammonium becomes susceptible to gaseous losses as ammonia. But once the urea is incorporated into the soil, either through tillage or injection, or through a rain, basically dissolving it and moving it into the soil there, that risk is really reduced. So by using a urease inhibitor that Jeff mentioned earlier, this can provide the greatest benefit when urea is applied on the soil surface, so through broadcasting. And what it does is it reduces the activity of that urease enzyme and just allows time for that fertilizer to be incorporated by rainfall into the soil. The second route that nitrogen is lost is through nitrification and leaching. So nitrification is the conversion of ammonium to nitrate by bacteria in the soil. Nitrate is susceptible to losses through leaching since it's a negatively charged ion, so it's not really held in the soil's cation exchange sites, and it can travel freely in water. It can also be lost in the atmosphere through denitrification to nitrous oxide or nitric oxide gases under warm or waterlogged soil conditions. Not ones that we've seen a lot down in my corner of the Southwest here the last year or so, but the use of a nitrification inhibitor, which is actually a pesticide that kills those nitrifying bacteria, can prevent that ammonium conversion into nitrate and reduce those losses associated with nitrate. These products provide the greatest benefit in scenarios, where nitrate is leaching or where denitrification losses are likely, such as fall application or poorly drained fields. That being said, we've seen pretty considerable uptake of these products, urease inhibitors and nitrification inhibitors, in grain production to improve that efficiency of nitrogen uptake, but there's been limited uptake in forage production scenarios. So preventing the loss of that nitrogen through volatilization or leaching can improve the retention of nitrogen by those crops, and in this case, we're talking forage stands. The hope is that through that mechanism, you have increased yields. I think that it's important to stress that nitrogen is an expensive nutrient, especially when we conducted this project last year where we were seeing record fertilizer prices here, or nitrogen prices for sure. So maximizing that retention is a really cost-effective method of improving your returns from that as well, while also reducing those environmental risks too. So the primary objectives of this project were to demonstrate the potential yield benefits and determine the economics of fertilizing old forage stands with or without the use of those nitrogen loss inhibiting products as part of a complete fertility plan for forage stands. A secondary component to this project this year was estimating the nitrogen losses from forage stands fertilized with or without the use of those nitrogen loss products. This project, has been previously conducted in 2020 and 2021, so this is the third year of this study. The previous 2 years, similar to this year in some areas of the province, have been conducted under pretty dry conditions, but regardless, in all cases, we did see that any fertilizer application at all considerably increased the yields of those old forage stands. And then in some cases, we saw even further increased yields when using a nitrogen loss inhibiting product, and that actually reduced the cost of hay production as well. And then depending on the yield response that we saw, which was largely dependent upon the moisture that the sites received, the cost of fertilizing at sub-sites was actually less than the cost it would incur to purchase additional feed. So it was cheaper to produce feed on farm than it would be to purchase hay elsewhere. So this year, when we were looking at sites for 2022, we selected some areas throughout the province that hadn't been evaluated so that we would get a better geographical kind of representation throughout the province here. We had 3 sites, one in Weyburn, one in Yorkton, and one at Clavette. I'm going to be focusing on the results of Weyburn and Yorkton today because they're a little clearer. We selected sites based on being a predominantly grass stand, so less than 30% alfalfa, and being over 8 years of age. I think that the sites for Weyburn was 11 years old and Yorkton, I believe, was around 10, with no history of fertilizer or manure application, so no fertility management. We did make sure that these forage stands had intact composition, so they hadn't totally lost all the species present. And that was just kind of a visual observation by the specialists involved there. And then, of course, based on producer interest, we can be pretty needy when we're running some of these projects, and small plot trials are maybe not every producer's favorite thing to do. So we found some pretty helpful producers here who are interested in partnering with us as well. For both of these sites, we actually designed our fertilizer blend based off removal rates because in many cases, that's the most accessible approach for producers with fertilizer stands. So we based it on a removal rate of 2 tons per acre, which wound up being a fertilizer blend of 68, 20, 30. This is a bit lower on potassium and didn't include any sulfur, unfortunately, than we would like, but unfortunately, we are in a bit of a limited budget for these projects, and the really high fertilizer costs this year were a bit prohibitive, so we kind of prioritized N and P in this case. We did soil testing in the spring and in the fall. We measured rainfall accumulation, forage yield, and forage quality, and also kept track of the economics of production here. And then we also, newly this year, which is a component that we haven't measured in the previous 2 years of the study, was an estimation of nitrogen loss to volatilization. And how we did that was by use of these Gastech passive dosimeters, which I'm going to refer to as Dosi tubes from here on out, which contain a packing material that you'll see there is actually a purple color that changes to yellow when it reacts with ammonia in the air. So we placed these under a semi-static chamber, which is a fancy word for that Canadian Tire bucket that we drilled some holes in and tent pegged down so that the strong winds in this province couldn't blow it away. And we used a calibration or a calculation using these numbers or the measurement of the ammonia volatilization to determine the pounds per acre of nitrogen that was being lost in these plots through volatilization. So each of these plots, we had 4 10-acre plots at each treatment site, and there were 3 tubes per plot there. And they were placed in the field immediately following fertilization, and they were left there for at least 28 days afterwards, and they were checked twice weekly. So our first site, the Weyburn site, had 4 treatments. The control, which received no fertilizer application. The second plot received an untreated fertilizer, so basically a plain old fertilizer with no nitrogen loss products. Our second plot had fertilizer that was treated with ARM-U, which is a urease inhibitor. I work for the government, so I'm not here to sell any products, so I'm going to focus on their mode of action as opposed to the actual products themselves as we go through the results here. And then the fourth treatment was neon surface treated fertilizer, which is a combination urease and nitrification inhibiting product. We had fertilizer applied by floater here on May 19th. Plots were cut July 12th and then baled on July 24th, which is a little longer than we would have liked due to some rain delays. And this site received 10.45 total inches of rainfall from May 1st until the hay was cut. At this site, so I said earlier, we did spring and fall soil samples. So these weren't used to develop our fertilizer blends, as I kind of mentioned earlier, but instead were just to verify what the nutrient status of the soil looked like going into the project. And I think what we've done here is do a pretty good job of showing that we were quite deficient in nitrogen and phosphorus. There was sufficient potassium at this site, which isn't uncommon for the region, and then low sulfur, at least in the top 6 inches of the soil there. So an old forage stand. These weren't really surprising. When we look at our fall soil test results after fertilizer application, you know, we don't see really big differences. I think it's important to note that we don't really have any replication of these plots. There's 4 singular plots, so we don't have the ability to do any statistical analysis on any of these numbers. So the small numerical differences that we see here might not really have any weight, and I think that in this case, at least, these are all probably normal variation between soil samples and no real differences in nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium levels between the spring and fall soil tests there. When we look at the DOSI tube results here, I think is when these results get quite exciting from this project. So when you look at the very top line there, the green is representing the untreated fertilizer, which is the one that did not have any fertilizer or nitrogen loss protection product, my apologies. And we saw about 14.2 pounds per acre of nitrogen lost using those calculations. This is just an estimate. I wouldn't say these numbers are hard and fast, but we do see that bare fertilizer had the highest nitrogen losses. Our second highest was that combination urease and nitrification inhibitor product at 1.7 pounds per acre loss, closely followed by the urease inhibiting product at 1.1 pounds per acre. And then, not surprisingly, we didn't see any nitrogen lost from our control plot that did not have any fertilizer applied. So I think that this is a really nice graph demonstrating the reduction in nitrogen losses by using those products. More excitingly, perhaps, we saw some pretty dramatic improvements in forage yields by utilizing these products. By even applying any fertilizer at all, we increased forage yield by over 1,200 pounds per acre, so that was pretty exciting. And then that increase in yield continued to climb when incorporating urease or the urease and nitrification inhibiting product there. When we look at the forage nutrient composition, there isn't a lot to report here. You know, we do see some decreases in acid detergent fiber as you go through the forage treatments there, and some changes in neutral detergent fiber, but overall the total digestible nutrient content or the energy content of these feeds really didn't vary much between treatments. So while there are some implications for feed quality, I really don't think that the improvement in energy content here would be enough to offset the cost of fertilizing. So while I think it's a nice parameter for us to evaluate here, I don't think that the results we saw at this site are certainly ones that I would use to try and convince you to fertilize your forage, especially when we look at the input costs that we saw at the site this year. Speaking of input costs, so we were at about $130 an acre for fertilizer this year, which was close to double the fertilizer costs in previous years. We saw anywhere $5 to $10 per acre for the additives that we used. And I've provided estimates here for cutting and baling based on the machinery rate guides that the government provides and land rent based on the land lease survey from 2019. So most of the input costs here are considered, and we've kind of summarized those there as a total cost per pound of feed produced. So what we see here is, you know, yes, all of these treatments or any fertilizer application was more costly than not fertilizing at all. But when we consider that earlier I mentioned producers were saying that they were paying at least 10 cents a pound for feed, all of these fertilized treatments were still well below market value and increased yield pretty dramatically. So I think that just goes back to the risk management aspect that this provides producers. Moving on to our Yorkton site, we again had 4 treatments, the control with no fertilizer applied, the untreated fertilizer, which is just a bare fertilizer, no nitrogen loss products. We had our 3rd treatment was an agrotane treated fertilizer, which is a urease inhibitor, and the 4th one was Entrant Next Gen treated fertilizer, which is a nitrification only product. Fertilizer here was spread June 4th, which was a bit later than ideal. Plots were cut July 24th and baled on August 10th, and this site received 14.57 inches of rain from May 1st to cutting, so lots of rainfall again. Similar to the soil test results that we saw in Weyburn here, so I think we successfully made the point that this stand was deficient in most nutrients aside from sulfur, which we weren't fertilizing anyways. So, you know, low nitrogen levels there, low phosphorus and low potassium at this site. After fertilization in the fall, again, we see very little difference between our spring and fall soil tests that we can probably chalk up to differences in fertilizer application here. So most of the nutrients we applied, maybe with the exception of phosphorus, were utilized by the plants there. When we look at the nitrogen loss estimates or the volatilization here, it's not quite as beautiful as the Weyburn site for a couple of reasons. Starting at the top of the graph there, you'll see the untreated treatment is in green again with the highest fertilizer or nitrogen losses here at 16.5 pounds per acre. Maybe surprisingly to some, second to that is the nitrification inhibitor at 15.6 pounds per acre of nitrogen lost. So the tricky part about this graph, or about the method that we used, is we only measured ammonia losses, which nitrification inhibitors, if you'll recall, don't actually protect against. They protect against leaching or losses as nitric and nitric oxide gases. So what we did here is just kind of sneakily measured the one form of nitrogen loss that a nitrification inhibitor doesn't really protect against. So it looks bad in this case because that nitrification inhibitor was protecting against nitrogen loss in other forms. So pretty high volatilization with that treatment still, but you'll see it was reduced greatly for the urease inhibitor treatment at about half of the nitrogen losses that those other 2 treatments saw there. And again, the control treatment, no fertilizer or no nitrogen losses there because there was no fertilizer applied. That wasn't super surprising. Our yield results here were a bit higher than down in Weyburn, not surprising since we changed soil zones. Our control plot yielded about 3,400 pounds per acre, which jumped up to 4,300 with any fertilizer application, so about 1,100 pound increase there. And again, pretty dramatic increases at this site with use of the urease inhibitor and the nitrification inhibitor product. So no statistics. I can't tell you whether or not these are all significantly different, but numerically, this is a pretty impressive improvement in forage yield with that fertilizer application. And again, there is a bit of variability here. We did see an improvement in crude protein content by several % by applying a fertilizer at this site. Acid detergent fiber content did go down again, and NDF did go down kind of linearly with the fertilizer application, which suggests an improvement in forage quality. We do see some improvements in TDN, some small improvements there, probably a 2% difference. So while I think these are nice from a forage quality standpoint, I still don't think that they're quite dramatic enough, maybe except for the crude protein in this case, to justify the costs of fertilizer application. When we look at the economics for this site, again, we're sitting at about $130 an acre. Given that the yields were much higher here, you'll notice that our total costs were less than we saw at the Weyburn site, but costs of the additive were a bit higher here, and land rent I think is a little bit lower. So overall, these values are consistent with what we saw at the Weyburn site, with the control plot being the least cost option, obviously without the fertilizer input. But as we use those fertilizers, you see an increase there to about 5.5 cents a pound. The urease inhibitor reduces that by about 3 cents a pound at 5.2 cents a pound. And then the nitrification inhibitor with the highest yields, again, further decreases that to about 5 cents a pound. So well below market value for feed. You're still producing feed for less on farm than you would be able to sell it for. So there is a potential profit opportunity there for producers as well. So that kind of wraps up the results of this project here. I think there's a few key things to consider when we look at these results though. Firstly, you know, we had pretty high fertilizer costs this year. If those were the largest cost incurred for this project by far. If those were lower, I think we would see much higher potential returns or much lower cost of production for that forage. You know, despite the really late fertilizer application at the Yorkton site, we still saw those pretty dramatic improvements in forage yield. So I think that's a really good testimony to the impacts that fertilizer application can have. And I think that those might have even been pushed higher had we got that fertilizer applied earlier when that grass needed it. You know, I used estimates from the guides provided by the Ministry of Ag here for rent, baling, and cutting, but those might vary on your own operation. So I think it's important to know your own cost of production so that you can, you know, determine the value of hay on your own operation. You know, fertilizing in some cases is an option to stretch your land a few years and offset those costs of breaking, seeding, reseeding. And I think that it's just one really good approach for producers to look at as a rejuvenation technique here. And again, especially with these two sites, we saw very timely rainfall. And so I'm not sure, I don't think we can say that without the large amount of rainfall that these two sites received fairly early on after fertilizer application, that we would have seen the dramatic improvement in yields that we did. But I think that's an important factor for producers to consider prior to applying fertilizer in their field is, you know, I know we can't all be weathermen, but try and get a rainfall in the forecast there when you're thinking about putting that fertilizer down to try and maximize your retention there. So some conclusions here, you know, the addition of fertilizer did result in increased yields over those unfertilized treatments at both these sites. Despite the high costs, our total forage production costs were equivalent to market value for forage or lesser than in all these cases. Using those nitrogen loss inhibiting products did reduce the cost of fertilizing by small amounts per pound of hay produced, which will be magnified when you look at large numbers of acres of hay production. And they did reduce that nitrogen loss to volatilization, so they are doing their job. We just had a really nice way of visually representing that with this project. But again, that magnitude of benefit is dependent upon timely rainfall. My take-home messages today are to consider implementing a fertility management plan for your forage stands to try and improve that productivity and longevity there. If you're fertilizing your forage stands, use that nitrogen loss inhibitor product. That might result in improved forage yields and does reduce those losses, but again, timely rains. And then finally, that in most cases, that cost of fertilizing was equivalent to or lower than cost of purchasing replacement forage. So again, I just want to drive home the risk management opportunity there. We're always saying, you know, plan for a drought or plan for worst case scenario. And I think that if year over year you can do what you can to improve that forage yield, that's one step towards managing risk on your operation. For agronomists, I guess more specifically, I think a really good take-home message from this is that there's a lot of opportunity here to educate producers and expand into this market and to increase the adoption of those nitrogen loss protection products as well. With that, I would like to thank some of our partners on this project. So the Saskatchewan Forage Council was an administrator. The Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association partially funded the work of this project as well as the other specialists in Yorkton, Caitlin McMurphy and Charlotte Ward, who ran the Yorkton site there, as well as our summer students, Claire Littingham and Declan Fleming, and of course the participating producers that put up with all of our shenanigans. And without this project wouldn't be possible. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions there may be.
Thank you so much, Jordan. If you haven't already done so, please type your questions in the question box on the bottom right-hand side of the control panel. And while they're getting started doing that, I have a couple of questions of my own. So can you just comment for those who aren't aware on the nutrition side, how those protein and TDN numbers kind of looked for animals in mid or late gestation?
Alexis, I love that you asked that. So I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head there. I believe at the Yorkton site that the original forage came in at around, without any fertilizer application, it was about 6%. So mid or late gestation, that would get pretty tough to use, and it was bumped up to about 8 and then 10% with that fertilizer application. So the protein content at that site for sure dramatically improved the suitability of that forage for mid to late gestation cattle. As far as the Weyburn site goes, we didn't really see dramatic enough differences, but the protein content of that forage was 11 or 12% in the first place. So there was a little bit more alfalfa in that stand, still less than 30%, but those protein levels wouldn't have been a problem for most classes of cattle at that stand, nor the TDN levels there. It was a fairly high quality forage that we got, but regardless, you know, I think that we did improve forage quality, but I don't know. I haven't penciled out whether or not the pound for pound cost of nutrients gained would really pencil out for this, or if you'd be better off purchasing an energy or protein supplement otherwise.
Fair enough. I think that was a pretty fair answer. The other question here is, what type of grass was in the stands? Mostly brome, or do you know if there were other species present as well?
So I know for the Weyburn site, it was crested wheatgrass, there was a little bit of brome, and then some Kentucky bluegrass, so not a very fancy grass stand there. I believe it was a mostly smooth brome mix up at Yorkton, but I don't know if Caitlin or Charlotte are here, if they'd be able to comment. Yeah, but they varied a bit by the two sites, mostly due to the forage that was suitable for those regions. I was pretty impressed with the response of the crested wheat. It came back pretty strong at the Weyburn site there with the fertilizer application. It was looking pretty tired before we got out there and applied fertilizer, so that was really nice to see.
Perfect. A couple other questions here. So one of the questions was, do you know if there's like any repeatability to this? Like, I think it's been discussed at least here at Ranch Management a couple of times, just the different results over the year. Do you have any direct comparisons you can offer?
So we presented our economic results a little differently this year than in past years. I wasn't actually with the ministry when the previous projects were run, so my knowledge of them is basically on looking back to previous results or previous presentations. But I think that the improvement in rainfall, or the large amount of rainfall we saw this year, really bumped the results of this project. In previous years, based on what I've seen in those results there, they did see improvements in forage yield for sure, but it wasn't quite to the same magnitude. They didn't measure the nitrogen loss previously, so I can't speak to that, but I would say the biggest challenge with our results this year to previous years is just that costs were so much higher. So it still was profitable in previous years, and it still did reduce the cost of fertilizer application by using those urease and nitrification inhibitor products, which did improve yield at most sites, but they just started out with much lower costs. So the baseline opportunity for profit was they were in a better position to begin with, if that makes sense there.
Absolutely does. Another question came through here. So with the increase in protein post-fertilizer application at Yorkton, could that be due to the benefit of potassium in the fertilizer, as the Yorkton soil was more deficient than Weyburn, pardon me?
It could be. I am not a great plant scientist when it comes to what specific nutrients do in the forage stand, I'll be honest. I look at this more from a yield and forage quality standpoint. I think that is one possibility. I also think that part of it is that there was far less alfalfa in the stand in Yorkton than we saw at Weyburn, which I think is why we saw such dramatic differences in crude protein to begin with. So I think that, I mean, we know based on previous work that a grass stand is more likely to respond to nitrogen than alfalfa. So I think that part of that is just a little bit due to the stand composition. There wasn't nearly as much alfalfa up at Yorkton as we saw down at Weyburn, but it could potentially be due to the phosphorus content as well, yes.
Okay. There's also a question here. Do you know of any long-term concerns with the NI? It was noted that it was a pesticide.
So I said it was a pesticide to the bacteria. I did. I guess I don't think there are long-term concerns there. It basically just reduces the activity of those bacteria for a short amount of time. Again, I'm not an agronomist. I don't know the exact nitty-gritty details there, but to my knowledge, no, there wouldn't be any concerns with long-term use there. I think that for forage stands and when we're looking at broadcast application, that you're probably going to get the most bang for your buck with the urease inhibitor. And I know that sounds a little funny when I showed that both the products today that had a nitrification inhibitor component in them did have the highest yields, but I think that the biggest difference there is just that urease inhibitor, which protects that surface reaction there. But to my knowledge, there would not be any detriments to using a nitrification inhibitor long term. I think when you look at a 2-week reduction, that there's still a lot of time in the year. I don't think it's that detrimental to the soil bacterial communities.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple other questions. Do you have any plans to collect yield data on the 2022 sites going forward? So Dr. Schoenau had touched on there's maybe some year-over-year benefits. Do you have any plans to look at that?
So we actually only put in funding for a 1-year study here. I do believe that at the Yorkton site, it's pretty close to town there, they were going to go back and collect clippings to do yield estimates. We don't have plans at the Weyburn site to measure it next year, though, unfortunately, no. We did just kind of intend a 1-year study here, as with the previous years of this project as well.
Okay, final question. So did participating producers indicate whether or not they would consider a blanket application on the remainder of the site that was not used in the project? So basically, like, were they satisfied with the results?
So I can speak for the producer in Weyburn. This is actually a pasture patron group that participated in this project. They had a really nice hayfield that was really suitable for this project. I know they were pretty impressed with the results here. I just don't think that it pencils out for them to apply the fertilizer year after year. They end up just kind of not raffling, but they do a lottery basically for who gets to hay it and keep the hay. So I don't think that the pasture will consider it, just because the cost of fertilizer incurred to the pasture doesn't usually offset the costs there. I'm not sure about Yorkton. That wasn't the site I ran. I didn't have a lot of personal communication with that producer. I do believe that he implements fertilizing on some of his other stands though. So I think that I'm guessing that Charlotte and Caitlin will certainly be on him after this and showing him the results that we saw here, and I think it makes a pretty good testimony. So hopefully, but I don't know from personal discussion with him personally, no. Okay, we'll call that the last call for questions here. So just hold on for 1 second while we're waiting for the last call questions. Just remind everyone that there are 4 more sessions for Ranch Management Forum occurring on March 1st, 7th, 8th, and 9th on a variety of topics. If you have any other further questions regarding this topic or other agriculture-related questions or inquiries, please feel free to contact your local Saskatchewan Agriculture Regional Office or the Ag Knowledge Center at 1-866-457-2377, or you can visit our website at saskatchewan.ca/agriculture. Thanks so much to Jordan and Dr. Schoenau for providing their presentations today. And with that, we'll close the webinar. Thank you.